Good morning. You have no idea how much I look forward to this first day. Oh, that's your volume right here. How do we cut? You have no idea how I enjoy it so much that I hear myself twice. As you've seen from the website, we've sort of lost track of whether this is the 40th consecutive year, the 41st consecutive year, the 42nd consecutive year. But as far as we know, let's say roughly 40 years of Science on Saturday lectures in this very spot. And my name's Andrew Zwicker. I get the incredible privilege and honor of hosting the series. On the screen in front of or behind me, and for all our folks on Zoom that can see it, is Ron Hatcher. And we named the lecture series after Ronnie. Ron was where I was before me for many, many years, and really the driving force here. He was an electrical engineer who tragically passed away about a decade ago. He's the one who sort of took Science on Saturday and just turned it into what you now see in front of you. And so we honor him by naming the entire lecture series after him. I'm curious, show of hands, for those of you who are here, not on Zoom, how many is your first time? Oh. Now watch this. How many people have been coming as far as they can remember for the last 10 years? Right? Well, hold on. Who thinks they've been coming for 20 years? There we go. Anybody 30 years? Oh, and I got to ask, anybody 40 years? TK. And over 40 years, we know like science changes, but curiosity about the world and the universe doesn't. And to bring some of the most amazing speakers to talk about their research so that you can hear from them and ask them questions is at the heart of Science on Saturday. So just so grateful that each of you are here. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things and we'll jump right in. I don't think it's here, but in case of emergency, I mean, you came in, so you know the exits are there. There is another exit right here, but it has not happened in 40 years. And so, right, I hear one. There's a bunch of science-loving people. Let's all knock on pretend wood. So, welcome back. We missed you so much. Um, Masks are optional. We know that the COVID rates have come up. If just so you're aware, we do here at the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory have a very formal mask policy. And if we ever reach a COVID rate in the local community that required us to go to required masks here, we would then ask all of you to go to required masks as well. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the lecture, and then we'll have people passing around microphones because we do have a bunch of people on Zoom as well. And then for the Zoom folks, if you'd like to ask a question, if you can put it into the chat, and I'll try to monitor that and get to some of those as well. Right? Or raise your hand like it says here since I didn't read it, and I'll just call on you. We know that you don't really come for the science, you come for the coffee, the donuts, and the bagels, and we all pretend that we're here for the science. But no matter what happens in this laboratory, we know that the number one budget priority is to make sure we have enough bagels, donuts, and coffee. So a few thank yous before we get started. In the back right now are Harry. Harry, how do you say your last name? Samotulalis? Maybe? Did I come close? He's in the back from AV, Anthony Pizzo, and he alternate. Didi Ortiz, where's Didi? There she is. Give her a big round of applause. Okay, so enough of me talking. It's time to move on to our lecture. I knew that when we started putting this together, that the one topic after COVID that's on every single person's mind is the rise of artificial intelligence. I assume at this point, many of you have tried out ChatGPT. To the students in the room, do not use that for your homework. I actually was talking to people on campus about the fact that using ChatGPT without acknowledging it is in violation of the academic policy. Right? But today, can we get rid of the Zoom, Harry? The little Zoom that's on the top of the slides? Today, it is an honor from Rutgers University, Professor Ahmed Elgammal, who is going to talk about his research. We were talking before about the fact that it is now the #1 topic on anyone's mind. His talk today is going to talk about art in the age of artificial intelligence, but I'd like to bring him up because you know, and I warned him that I have 3 questions to ask him before we get started, so come on up.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for being here. For those of you who are the first time, I asked the same speaker the same 3 questions. I stole these questions from Ronnie Hatcher. He was asking these questions. So these are tough scientific questions. First one, if you'd share with the audience, when did you first get interested in science?
Very long time ago, when I was at school, of course, I did a lot of at-home science experiments. I was raised up actually in Alexandria in Egypt. And that has to do with why I end up doing science and art, because growing up, I wanted to study something related to art history or architecture or archaeology, something art related. At the same time, I always have been inspired by science, and it was a big thing in my life. And I have to combine these 2 careers. And when I come to college, I have to decide. We didn't have the luxury of double majors or things like that. I have to decide 1 major in college. Everybody told me that if you take a career in art, might not be a good idea, money-wise. So I liked science, and computer science was something new at the time when I was in college back in the 80s. So I decided to go to computer science, but I never gave up my love for art and understanding art and art history. So at some point of my career, I combined them, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. That was a long answer for the question.
That was a great answer. So, okay, so art and computer science and science. How about a teacher who had influence on you from the time you were a little boy up through graduate school?
Many teachers, in particular, always science teachers. Physics teacher in particular. In college, I remember my first physics professor was amazing, because really he is the one who introduced me to modern physics. And that was mind-changing and amazing. And he's the kind of professor that kind of learned on people who learned on the Einstein and this generation. So they know science very different from the way we deal with it now. It's amazing.
Wonderful. So last question. When you're not doing your research, a hobby, something that you enjoy that's not scientific?
Obviously, making art.
Making art. Are you a painter, a sculptor?
No, digital art.
You're a digital artist. Do you use AI to make your art?
Of course.
Of course you do. Wait, how is that a hobby? This is your research.
That's what it is. It's my research is my hobby.
Well, thank you so much for being here, for kicking off the
Thank you very much.
2024 Science and Saturday lecture, Art in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, from Professor Ahmed Elgammal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so let me start making things okay here. All right, the ultimate goal of AI research is really to make a machine that has some perceptual, cognitive, and intellectual abilities like those of humans. And when we look at art in particular, these questions come to mind because I am an AI researcher by training. For the last 30 years, I've been doing AI research, in particular computer vision. 10 years ago, when you look at images like that, using AI or computer vision, you would recognize there is a man, there is a woman, there is a tree, there is fruits, things like that. But obviously, when we look at art, this is not what we're looking for. We're looking at art is much deeper than just looking at what objects are in the image. There are layers and layers of understanding, and also art affect us emotionally when we see it or listen to it. So these are fundamental questions that always intrigued me. How can we make the computers understand something about art? So I believe understanding and generate human-level creative products in general, such as poetry, stories, jokes, music, paintings, is fundamental to show that artificial intelligence is actually intelligence. So these are fundamental nature of human intelligence. AI and art, that's always a question. When I give these talks, one of the fundamental questions I am asked is, how can art and AI or art and science be combined? Isn't art or aesthetic judgment in general a subjective matter, while science is objective? How can we approach art in a scientific way? That's always a big question. And that question is actually rooted in the philosophy of Western philosophy. For example, Immanuel Kant, in his critique of aesthetic judgment, this is a quote from that book. Thankfully, one of my collaborators pointed out, Emily Spratt, actually from Princeton here, pointed out this to me a few years ago. He's saying basically, he's making a distinction between judgment, aesthetic judgment, and reasoning. He's saying basically, judgment of taste is not cognitive judgment and is not logical, but aesthetic, which means that it has one whose determining ground cannot be other than subjective. That's basically the stand of many philosophers through the centuries. On the other hand, here's another quote from a scientist. He's Colin Martindale, was a psychologist at Maine, University of Maine, and he has a great book called The Clockwork Muse. And he's saying, as a scientist, I feel that if everything in the universe is governed by laws, then art history must be as well. Very different view, of course. And here's another quote from Eric Kendall, the Nobel laureate, from one of his books also. He's saying, by examining the perception of art as an interpretation of sensory experience, scientific analysis can, in principle, describe how the brain perceive and respond to a work of art and give us insight into how this experience transcend our everyday perception of the world around us. Can any aspect of art, which is a creative, subjective experience, be studied objectively? That's very fundamental, and that's in line with what I'm going to talk about today. The last quote is from an art historian, George Kubler, from his book, The Shape of Time. He's saying art history could prove to contain unexpected potentialities as a predictive science. So now, taking all these different views of the subject, what are the implications of looking at art through the eyes of the machine? I'm going to try to answer these 4 questions. Obviously, I'm not going to give you the final answer here. I'll just intrigue you to think about this question. Is art history and art making and art evolution something predictable? Is creativity something measurable? Can the machine be creative? And finally, can the machine make art? I put art here between quotes because we have to question what is art to start with. So a few years ago, actually 12 years ago, I started the Art and AI lab at Rutgers. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, to combine my passion about art and science, but also because I'm really intrigued about these questions. And I have been collaborating with many people, including Professor Mariam Mazzoni from College of Charleston, and Professor Elizabeth Desmarais from Rutgers, and many students from Rutgers and even from Princeton here. Some of the activities we have done over the years, I'm going to talk about some of them today, building computational models that can look at a piece of art and understand it somehow. What is the genre? What is the subject matter? What is the iconography? What is the style? Things like that. Looking at influences between artists. For example, 2 artworks here from different 50 years apart, and we can really look at them and understand influences between artists, understanding how creativity evolved over time, and how art history evolved over time. So I'm going to talk about some of these today. In general, AI can be involved in the analysis of art and in the synthesis or generation of art. And these are 2 different things that we have been working on, and I'm going to talk about them today. And if you look at the analysis of art itself, it also can be done at the macro level or the micro level. Macro level means that what happened if you look at thousands and millions of artworks over time. Every point here in this is just one artwork. And we take lots and lots of artworks and try to understand how things has changed over time. That's a macro level. And there are a lot of things that we can really, AI can do here that we human cannot do, because the way that AI can mass this large data can give us a lot of information. On the other level, in the micro level, if you go to the brushstroke level of art, AI can really be useful also. We have work on how can we analyze an artwork and tell whether it's a fake art or a real art. Is it a real Picasso here or a fake copy of Picasso? So we have actually a lot of work on that, some patents also about this. So I'm going to mainly talk about the macro level today. When we look at an artwork like that, artist and art historian talk about that art with certain language. There are elements of art. People talk about space, texture, form, shape, and things like that. People talk about principles of art, movement, unity, harmony, variety, balance. And there's other topics like subject matter, brush strokes, meaning, historical context. All these are very important things when you talk about art. So it's obviously not just finding what are the objects in the image. It's much more than that. So one of the things that we have been working on extensively is how can we quantify all these elements? Can you look at an image of art and quantify the texture, the shape, the color, the movement, the harmony, all these elements of art? In particular, we looked at style. Style is very fundamental in understanding art. What style? We all know what a style is, and here is an example of an several artworks depicting the same subject, the Last Supper, over history. Here's the famous Da Vinci one here, but before Da Vinci, prior to Renaissance, and Baroque. So you see artists depicting the same subject in a changing manner over time. So that's a really fundamental question. Why is that? Why artists change their style? And what characterizes this change? When we say that there's a change in style, that's really a fundamental question in art, and I believe that science can help in answering this question. So one of the first things that we have done and have been doing over the years is a simple question, which is style classification. If I give the machine an image of an artwork like that, can it label it? It's a Baroque, it's a Renaissance, it's Cubism, it's Impressionism. Can it do that? Because that's a trivial question. That's really what AI people do, supervised learning, basically. You give it a label, and the machine can look at the elements and in the image and try to classify this. And yes, we can classify style with more than 12x than the random guess. I can give you an image, and the machine can tell me this is a Renaissance, this is Impressionism, and things like that. The machine can classify style. So what? Why that's even important? After all, these style labels are something that comes after the fact. The art historian give these labels just to indicate certain movements. People who actually make the art at the time didn't think about it this way. They didn't think, I'm going to make a new style. I'm just basically making art. Why art evolved to make this style? That's really the question. So the real question is, what characterized the evolution of art style change over time? That's the fundamental questions. And what factor drive the changes in art style over time? Obviously, when you answer this question, there are elements that goes related to the historical context, religious context, social context that I'm not going to be addressing today. I'm talking about this from the formal elements point of view and from psychology point of view, human psychology point of view. So we have been trying to build a computational model that can help answer these questions. And here are some of the answers that we found out, which I'm going to explain. What characterizes the evolution of style change over time? Two things, sequence and ordering, and something called prime object and replica mass. What factor drive changes in art style over time from psychology, human psychology point of view? Basically, habituation and innovation. This is a short answer. Let me now dig into the longer answer. So if the machine can classify style successfully, that implies that the machine must have learned some internal representation that includes some feature, some visual feature that relate to styles. So what are these features? So we really look at how the machine can understand the visual element in an image and interpret it, and how that related to human interpretation. In particular, in art history, Heinrich Wolflin was a pioneering in the study of form, separation of form from subject matter, like as I showed in the last suburb example. And he in particular have a theory that he teach his student about how can you tell the difference between Renaissance artwork and Baroque artwork. And he come up with these five pairs of or five dimension to look at. For example, in Renaissance, everything was linear. The contour were linear, while in Baroque, everything, the contour become fuzzy and painterly. In Renaissance, everything was planar, in one plane, while in Baroque, it becomes, there's depth, recessional, there's depth of fields. Closed form, everything goes in the canvas here, while here it's something, it's part of a bigger scene, it's open form. Here, every subject by himself, while here there's unity. Here, the clarity is absolute, here the clarity is relative. So he hypothesized that these are the elements that tells the difference between Renaissance and Baroque, and even hypothesized that these are the five elements that you can use them to make difference between any art movement, any style basically can be characterized along these five dimensions. So that's basically what we call in science a hypothesis, or basically a conjecture. How can we prove it? We can have a lot of images and we can look at them and see that support this theory, right? Can science and AI help us in understanding this? So what we have done is we use AI, in particular, we use deep neural network to learn styles. So basically, deep neural network is a sequence of artificial neurons, very crude simulation of the neural cell in your brain, very similar, very cartoonish kind of simulation, where you connect them in layers and layers and layers and layers above each other until you have at the end activations here. And the activation here will be the style classes. It's Renaissance, it's a Baroque, it's Impressionism and things like that. So you train these networks by just showing it images and telling it that this is a Renaissance, this is Baroque, this is Impressionism. And our goal is really to dig deeper here and understand what the machine have learned, why it can tell Renaissance from Baroque, what it have learned exactly. So we analyze the activations in these internal layers, and we use different techniques to understand that. These are techniques from statistics and machine learning, things like principal component analysis, independent component analysis, manifold learning, correlation with time, correlation with Wolflin pairs. That's really the important part here, how to correlate with Wolflin theory. And here is the finding. That's basically the finding that we have found. We have done this with many, many different models of neural networks. The first finding is when you look at what the machine learned in typical objects, when you train the machine on typical images of cats and dogs and cars, it always tries to learn things like edges, which is very similar to what the brain do. In the V1 part of the brain has edge detector. A machine typically learn these oriented edges. But when you train it on styles of art, it really didn't learn that. If you look at what the machine have learned, it didn't learn at all anything related to edges. It's very hard to interpret what the machine have learned here, but clearly you don't see many of these edges. So the machine doesn't care about what object in the image. It tries to learn something else related to the form that relates to style. All right, but that's very hard to interpret. But the main finding here is that when you look at what the machine have learned, that we find that between 6 and 10 factors can explain 95% of the visual variance in art history. So that we give these machines basically about 100,000 images of art history from Western civilization, in particular from in the last 500 years, spanning the last 500 years, from pre-Renaissance till today, basically. Lots of images. And it finds that it can explain what happened in that using only 6 to 9 factors. In fact, if you look at the first two modes of activation or two modes of variations, that can explain 60 to 74% of the variance. So what that mean? Basically, that means that if I plot a whole bunch of artworks like that, every point is an artwork, I can plot them using two variables like that, and these two variables will explain what happened in art history to a large extent. The visual variation, I'm talking about the form here. So we can see things like Renaissance happening here, Baroque happening here, and then all the way 18th century art here, Impressionism happening here, and then you can see Cézanne and early 20th century here, Picasso is here, and Cubism, and then pop art here, and so on. So here's something very interesting. When we train the machines with this corpus of art history, we never tell it anything about time. We give the machine only images and the label of the style. This Renaissance, this Baroque, this Impressionism. We never told the machine that Renaissance came before Baroque, or Renaissance happened in the 14th century, or Picasso was a Cubist artist. We never told the machine anything like that. The machine actually didn't know anything about the arts at all. Just the image and class label. The surprising thing here is that the machine arranged images in a correct chronological order to a large extent. You can see here the progression over time, 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, 18th century. So there is a clear correlation if you go clockwise like that with time. Actually, 0.7 correlation coefficient with time if you go clockwise, which is a very high number, very high correlation. So the machine actually learned this by itself. What that tell us? That tell us basically that art history evolve in a very predictable and sequential way. So actually, this is not this is a surprise, obviously, because the machine can learn that. But that's fundamental thing about the data itself. For example, if you look at different model that we have used, things like AlexNet, VisionNet, all these are just names of different deep network models. In all of them, we find this criteria, this correlation of time that the machine has learned. So it must be something about the data itself. In fact, if you look at Wolverine books, he actually had a quote in one of his books, I don't remember exactly, but something like art history go or evolve like a rock going downhill. Has to go really in a smooth way, one step at a time. So things has to come in order. So you cannot imagine at all that after Renaissance come Cubism, for example. Many things have to come in order slowly until you reach, for example, Cubism or modern art or things like that. So that's really the sequence aspect of art, the fact that art is changed in a sequential and ordered way. So the question now, what are these two axes here? What are the two axes that explain what happened in art history? Now you see basically 500 years of art history in one graph arranged. This is how the machine sees it. What are these two aspects? So we did correlation between these two axes here and the 5 pairs I mentioned from Wolverine. And we found that the first dimension, always the first dimension is correlated highly with recessional versus planar. And the second dimension always correlated highly with linear versus painterly. And now that gives us a theory about how form evolve over last 500 years of art history, according to the machine again. So basically in Renaissance, everything was planar and linear. And then Baroque, things become more recessional, depth of fields, make things more 3D and more painterly. And then from Baroque all the way till 19th century, people have increased in the painterly of their painterly aspect of their art. Painterly means that the contours become fuzzy until basically Impressionism. So in the top here you can find Impressionism. So Impressionism is really the highest, the most painterly experiment in art, basically, when every contour are become fuzzy, there's no contours at all. And then you can see after Impressionism, what happened is Cézanne came in particular, in Cézanne, because it was very fundamental, and start flattening the plane again, going away from being recessional to planar again. And that really characterized most of what happened in the 20th century. Cubism and abstract, it's all basically planar art again. There's no depth again, and becoming more and more linear again. So we closed the loop here. So we kind of went into one cycle. If according to these two variables, we went into one cycle over the last 500 years and going back to Renaissance again. Obviously, subject matter has changed and many things has changed, but in terms of form, we went into this cycle. Moreover, we can actually verify Wolverine theory now. So for example, if you look at Renaissance in the top here and Baroque in the bottom here, and look at the dimensions of the data that correlate the most between this separation between Renaissance and Baroque, we find that they correlate correctly with the 5 pairs of elements or 5 pairs of comparison that Wolverine suggested. So Wolverine was correct to a large extent that these are the 5 elements that you should actually use to tell difference between Renaissance and Baroque. But also we found things that doesn't go well with Wolverine theory, but I'm not going to go over that. For example, here is also, if you look at the activation manifolds, basically look at how the activation of these networks tell us about progression of art history. Again, you can see how things have changed. So, for example, you can see Renaissance is here, move to Baroque, move to all the way to neoclassicism in 19th century, to realism, to impressionism. It's here, and after impressionism, you can see 2 directions. The direction went to abstract art, cubism and abstract art, where there's another direction that went back and connect to Renaissance, and that's mainly expressionism. So you can see a lot of connection this way. So anyway, this is a rich topic that I can talk about for hours. So now I'm going to talk about what characterize the change in style, and in particular, the role of creativity. So now we understand that a style changes smoothly, but what characterizes a new style when it comes around? What happens when a new style comes around? So this is a work that we have done back in 2015 called Quantifying Creativity in Art Network. And we start by a silly question. It might be sound silly. Can we develop an algorithm that assesses the creativity of painting given its context in art history? It can sound very silly question, but why we need to answer this question? Because if you want to have AI agents that can be creative in the future, which is happening now, it has to have the ability to assess the creativity by itself. So since the dawn of AI, it has been always that human tell the machine what's creative and what's not creative. And if the machine makes something, we are the one who judge whether that's creative or not. But can the machine learn something about creativity that it can judge by itself when it makes something? Is that creative or not? That's really the fundamental question. So, but first we have to define what's creativity. And obviously this it's a long debate, historical debate about what is creativity. It keeps evolving, that definition, and many people have different definition based on where are you coming from psychology, from philosophy, from science. So, but in particular, there are 2 aspects that are fundamental in all these definitions. Something has to be novel compared to its prior art to be called creative, but that's not enough, because you can create something totally novel that's not relevant at all. So the other aspect, it has to be influential, meaning that people has to take notice of that, and it impacted the fields that you are in, whether you are doing science or doing art or any other things. The novelty and being influential is fundamental. All right, so what we did is basically, if we develop an algorithm to assess this creativity based on these 2 aspects, and it's quite simple actually. So if you take lots of artwork from history and try to connect them together by a simple connection, every artwork is a node in a graph, in a network, and there's a connection between them, temporal connection. For example, the arrow here go in the direction of time, so that art here came before that art. It's temporal connection. And there is a weight or a value on that connection, all right? And it's basically simple like that. We're gonna, on these weights here, we're gonna just measure how similar these artworks. And the idea is very simple. For example, look at this artwork. This is a Caravaggio from 1600. This is a French artist from 1800, 200 years apart. And if you look at them, they are quite similar, right? They are quite similar in the light-dark composition, the body pose, quite similar, right? So similarity between these 2 artworks tell us that basically Caravaggio might have an influence on the later artist, and the later artist may be doing a derivative work of Caravaggio. I mean, so it's in terms of creativity, that tell us basically that I should bump up the creativity of that work because it might have an influence on that work, and I should bump down the creativity of that artwork because it might be a derivative of the previous. All right. On the other hand, if you look at two artworks like that. This is by Sicily from 1883, and this is by Picasso 1907. Just by looking at these two artworks side by side, there is not much connection between them. There might be an implicit connection, but just visually we cannot see that connection. So so Pablo Picasso is not influenced here directly by that artwork. He's not a derivative of that. This work is not influential on that work, and that work is not a derivative of that work. These are two connections. These are the two reasonings that we're trying to make pairwise on every two pieces of art. Now, if you take this kind of reasoning and did it for every pair of artwork over history, what can you do? So now actually you can write a formula that propagates how every two artworks relate to each other, and how can that tell us about the creativity of each artwork in terms of how novel it was compared to its prior, and how influential it was in the future. This formula, I mean, forget about the details here. This is actually what's called network centrality. These are the same kind of formulas that are used when you're doing Google search. The Google rank algorithm, page rank algorithm that you do when you search Google is exactly similar to this, an example of this kind of algorithm, where basically every web page in the internet is a node in that graph, and we use this kind of algorithm to tell you what's important pages. Or when you look at pandemic and progression of pandemics in society, again, network centrality algorithm are what's used here. So the same kind of algorithm here is used to analyze creativity. And it's a zero-sum game, meaning that if I'm going to assign creativity to every artwork, everything has to sum up to constant. If some artwork has to have a high score, the other one has to go down. All right, it's very fundamental. Otherwise, you can give everybody a high score. Here is some results just to make sense of what's happening. So the x-axis here is time. It's going from 1400 all the way till 2000. Every point here is an artwork, and you can see some scoring high, some scoring low. Does that make sense? Well, it's very hard to make sense of things. What the feature that we use, or what we're trying to analyze here is mainly subject matter, how artists depicted subject matter. And here is something interesting. For example, just to the highest scoring artwork in 19th century was this artwork by Monet, haystack, one of the haystack from 1865. All right, so when you look at this, why the machine choose this one? We know that Monet have done a lot of haystacks in his Impressionist time. And Impressionist time came at least 15 years after that, more than 15 years after that. So basically the machine thinking, okay, this artwork has a lot of influence of what happened later, and was very different from what's happening at the time, how artists depicted landscape at the time. That was very different. And here is another artwork. One of the highest scoring artwork actually in 20th century was Munch, The Scream. Again, the machine doesn't know anything about Munch. I didn't ever told it to look at Munch and give it a high score. Just the machine look at all artworks, and it finds this is very different from anything it have seen before. And this has a lot of similarity of things happened after. So that must be creative. It's novel and influential. And the interesting thing is that if you look at a part of the history, we have a lot of data from 1850 to 1950. The machine really makes sense of much of what's happened in art history in a very interesting way. So basically, it highlights things like Picasso's Blue Period at some point, Klimt poster here scoring very high. And here is the interesting thing. If you look at the first 10 years of the 20th century, the highest scoring artwork in the first 10 years of the 20th century is Picasso's Ladies of Avignon, which is basically the artwork that art historians now tell you that this was the early beginning of Cubism. Again, the machine figured out this is something that I haven't seen before. I haven't seen anything like that. And this is something that influenced a lot of things that happened after. So the machine find out this by itself. And interestingly, what only tops that up is this part here. That's actually Cubism itself. So what really tops out that is Cubism itself at its peak in 1912 to 1915. So the machine really highlight that as very extremely, very different thing and novel thing. And then you can see that what's scoring higher than that is basically more abstract work. Here is something interesting. For example, look at things like Red Square by Malevich and Black Square and things like that. These are artwork, very abstract artwork like that, Red Square. Some art historian will tell you this is a very creative artwork, this is amazing artwork, or this is something that's very important. You might question why is that? It's a little square. The machine agreed. I mean, the machine find this very different and very influential. So that's really the objective versus subjective judgment here. And here is something very interesting. What is this point here? That's the highest point in the whole chart. What is this? When we look carefully, we find this. That is basically an artwork by Mondrian. But I realize there's a mistake here. That artwork here is dated 1910. And from my little understanding of art history, I realized this is a mistake. Mondrian did this in the 30s. Mondrian did that in 1930s, not 1910. So what happened here was there's a mistake in the data. The data has been labeled wrong, that it is 1910. And that let me think, okay, the algorithm is actually working. Because what happened here, the machine tell me that if Mondrian would have done that in 1910, he would have been the most creative artist of all time. That's basically the algorithm work, basically. So that gives me the idea of how to evaluate this, because the hardest part about this, how in science we need to evaluate our result. We need to have a way to tell if what we are doing makes sense or not, right? So how to validate the results? We didn't validate the result by looking at the result and give it people and ranking them, telling us whether that rating is correct or not, because again, it's subjective for human. What we did is what's called the art time machine. So the art time machine is very simple. Is inspired by this idea from Mondrian. What happens if you take an artwork from let's say Renaissance, and you change its time label, time stamp, and tell the machine this is done in 20th century or 19th century? Obviously, if the algorithm works correctly, a Renaissance work happening in 19th century is not creative, right? It's a derivative. And at the same time, if you take an artwork from 19th century or 20th century and mislabel it to be done in 1500, the algorithm should tell us that this is something ahead of its time and really creative, all right? This is the whole idea. So we did that. So basically, we take just small sets of images and change their labels, either move them forward or move them backward, and see what kind of change happened to the creativity score. And here is the result. So basically, when you take, if you just take Renaissance and Baroque and just randomly change their labels, small amount, there is not much change in time. But if you take Renaissance and Baroque and move them forward to around 1900, there's a drop in creativity score about 8 to 10%. So basically the algorithm really realized that this is not interesting if it was done in 19th century or 20th century. In contrast, if you take any of the modern art schools and put them back to 1600, their creativity score increased significantly. And again, the numbers here varies in a sensible way. For example, if you take Cubism and move it back, it's 13% increase. Expressionism, 16% increase. For example, if you take Neoclassicism and move it back, only 5% increase, because Neoclassicism in 19th century is basically reiteration of Renaissance for different social reasons, but basically it's Renaissance again. Or for example, Romanticism, 7%, because in Romanticism there's a lot of elements from Gothic art as well. So these changes actually make sense. So how that relate to the question, what characterize change in style and the role of creativity? That's the question I started with. So when I showed this result to one of Marianne Mazzoni in College of Charleston, my art historian collaborator, she pointed me to this book, George Kubler, The Shape of Time, Remarks on the History of Things. It's an amazing small book, very hard to read, but here's his theory. So Kubler theory say that basically changes in art form take place through a process of style pattern breaks, what he called prime objects, such as iconic work of art that are then widely reproduced in more forms over a period of time, what he called replica mass, to establish a style. So he tells us basically a theory about what makes a style, what makes a new style. So some artists, he didn't tell us why, some artists come up with a new artwork that's very different from what happened before, and that was influential so much. It might be debatable at that time, but some other artists really like it very much to the point that they started copying it in style, and that started forming a new style. So that's a moment in history when a new style happens, and that's what he called prime objects. So reading from his book, actually, I come up to these quotes here. He's saying prime object and replica and replication denote principal innovation and entire system of replicas, reproduction, copies, so forth. These are what's called the replica mask. And here comes the important part. He's saying prime object resemble prime numbers of mathematics because no conclusive rule is known to govern the appearance of either, although such a rule might someday be found. The two phenomena now escape regulation. Anyway, so I find this very, very interesting. George Kuller is an art historian, and this has this analogy to prime number when talking about prime object. It's very interesting for so many reasons, but in particular, it's interesting to me because the algorithm I just described is really, if you think about it this way, it's an algorithm to find the prime object. Because by construction, if you think of this graph as numbers, the nodes are numbers, and the arrows in the graph is divisibility, then the algorithm will give high score to prime numbers by construction. So what we did is exactly building an algorithm to find this prime object in art history. What are the objects in art history that are very different from its prior and very influential in the future? So we're finding this out. So basically, we're kind of validating Kubler theory based on the data. So let me just move now to the generation of art, or basically synthesis part of art using AI. Can the machine make art? And which really relate to other question, which is what drives that change? We understand now what characterize that change in style over time, but what makes artists really innovate to make a new style? What was it from psychology point of view? Again, not from the historical and social point of view. So that's related to what's happening today about image generation and using AI in art making. So I'll start by talking about art making today and go back to answer this question. Using AI in making art is not new. It's as old as AI itself. One of the pioneering artists who have been using AI in their art making is Harold Cohen. So Harold Cohen throughout the 80s and 90s have done a lot of work that uses AI, although the AI at that time was mainly rule-based systems, not generative AI like today. And here's some of his artwork, basically. Another example is Linear Schwartz, who is a computer graphics pioneer and also explored using AI in early times. And over the last few years, we have seen a lot of art that is done by different people using AI. You might recognize some of these. We have seen this in the media, including some of ours here I'm going to talk about. But let me just try to help you go navigate what's happening in that domain. So this, the last 10 years, actually, I'm going 2 years in the future till 2025, 1 year in the future as well. From 2015 till now, this is what happened in the last 10 years in terms of AI getting into the domain of art making. I'm not trying to say art making, I'm going to say image making, because making images is different from making art, and I'll clarify this. So back in 2015 or prior to that, there was a lot of work on style transfer. How can you give an image and a style, for example, a style of the Van Gogh Starry Night, for example, and give it a photo, and it applied that style to that photo. That's called style transfer. There are a lot of work on that on that domain at that time. So we kind of capture the essence of what is the style in terms of form, and how can we move it from one image to another. However, that was not generative. It's just transform one image to another. Came around 2014, 15, something called GAN, Generative Adversarial Network. So GANs is very fundamental in what we've seen today. Good fellow who's was at Google DeepMind at some point, came up with GAN in 2014. However, it was really very crude, very small images, only 16 by 16 images, 16 pixel by 16 pixel, or maybe 32 by 32, very small images, and very fuzzy. You cannot really make anything useful out of that. A couple of years later came what's called DC GAN, which is using the power of deep neural network, deep convolutional neural network, in making a little bit better images. So we can now give the machine some images of your bedrooms, for example, lots of bedrooms, and it can generate an image of another bedroom. Again, the images were very fuzzy, very small, 64 by 64 pixel, very tiny images, and very fuzzy, very not clear. However, that really created a lot of interest between artists. For the first time, the machine really can generate images. All right, how can I, as an artist, use it? I'm going to come to that, but let's just follow the history here. around 2019 came what's called StyleGAN by NVIDIA. So StyleGAN was the first time where we can generate 1 megapixel image, really a high resolution image that's photorealistic of these faces. So you have seen this in the media and usually came with the titles, these people didn't exist, or these people are not real. So basically train this system on lots and lots of faces of people, it can generate new faces. And it's very realistic, very photorealistic. And New York Times was running a survey in the last couple of weeks whether you can tell AI image from fake image. And that obviously makes a big problem of deep fakes and things like that. But we can get photorealistic images and very high quality. But with actually, that was only done for faces, meaning that this is only useful when you have a very strict object like a face that's always aligned and always have 2 eyes and nose and mouth, right? But if you start doing that for general objects, it didn't do well. Until, but before going back forward, if you look at online repository like GitHub, this is where basically people put open source code. Back in 2019, and just search the word GAN, you find 33,000 codes and papers of GANs at that time. So it's a lot of research have been done in few years about these GANs, and it influenced a lot of what's happening. Few years ago, a couple of years ago, in 2021, came DALL-E, the first version of DALL-E. And the interesting thing here is that for the first time now, not only you can teach the machine by looking at images, you can add language to the equation. I call it here the power of language. So now we can train the machine by images combined with a description of what's in the image. And the machine here can actually start to make much better quality images, because now the machine render the pixels in the image with a constraint of the language. It needs to render the images to make a face, to make a dog, to make a desk, to make an apple. So not just random manipulation of pixels. So that make a breakthrough in the quality of the images that you can generate. So we can write something like an armchair in the shape of an avocado, and the machine start creating these things, which is really creative. I mean, it give you creative ideas. And in the last couple of years, there have been a big process in that direction. I call it the power of massive data. Something called diffusion came around. It's a variation, a different thing from GANs that power DALL-E2 and power something called stable diffusion. Probably have heard about this term. However, I don't believe that diffusion is the reason why we see that big jump in quality. It's really the power of massive databases. Basically, these systems are trained on 5 trillion images from the internet, and that massive data is the reason why it's really getting much better. All right, so now let me roll back and explain to you what is GAN and how it works to get an understanding of image making using AI. So GANs, in a little nutshell, has 2 components. The way I describe it is like that. Suppose you have 2 aliens coming from outer space, and you task them with the task of making images of flowers, and you don't know what flowers are. All right, so you give one of them will be like a critic, and one of them will be the artist. The artist, you never seen any images of a flower, doesn't know what flower looks like. And the alien critic, you give them some images of flowers, so he have a reference to look at. Obviously, the generator or the alien artist will just generate random images at the beginning, just random images, and give that to the critic. The critic will compare the images from the artist to the images of flowers, and you can tell it's not the same. Doesn't have the structure, doesn't have the color. So they give that signal back to the artist and tell them, do better. So the artist will start basically maybe change the color, make some pattern, make lines, circles, whatever they're going to do, and give another batch of images to the critic again. And again, the critic will say, still, this doesn't look the same. This is not flowers. And the idea is, after lots and lots of iteration, the system will reach equilibrium somehow, and the artist will be able to generate some images, hopefully, that looks like a flower. That's basically how GAN works. So we start from total noise and try to build up to learn the concept of what a flower is, or what's in your images, whether it's faces or dogs or cats, and try to make images like that without even looking at them, just by guessing and improving. Other systems like diffusion models actually look at the images, try to reconstruct the images. But anyway, again, it starts from noise. So when this system came around, the result actually was very uncanny. For example, when you train this system on portraits, classical portraits, we feed it classical portraits for the last 500 years, and this is what it gave us. So basically what it gave us here is deformed portraits. It kind of reminds me of Francis Bacon portraits, right? But with a fundamental difference. Francis Bacon portraits here in the bottom is intentional. He has the intention to make these portraits deformed like that, all right? While the machine didn't have the intention to do that. The machine was tasked to make a correct portrait given the image. It just failed to make the correct portrait. And from that failure come this uncanny deformed look, which really inspired artists. Many artists like these GAN images because it gives you this surprise, this creative elements by accident, by totally, I call it my art, the aesthetics of machine failure, because it's not constructive, it's just accident failure. So what happened really in the last couple of years when images get better quality is really because of the language, because we added the language, so the images are not just a manipulation of pixel anymore, but language is in control of what it's trying to generate here. But going back a few years, the way I would like to you look at this is that really we are at a revolution now in terms of image making. If you look at the history of image making from prehistoric time till now, there are three main stages. There is a stage of human artists depicting the world on canvas, whether it's on the cave painting or using paint on canvas or mosaic on walls, or all of them is just the human trying to depict the world on canvas. That's how images are being made. Then came the cameras in the 19th century, and you have a physical device that captures light on canvas, on the film, or in a digital sensor in the digital age. All right, that's the second stage. Came digital art, which is not really, it's a human, I mean, digital art is really a human making images again, but in a computer. But now we come on a new way of making images, which is using AI, which is generative AI. How that's different? We are not looking at the physical world using cameras, or not human depicting the world on canvas using a paint or canvas. It's data. So the machine is looking at data and learning how to make an image. And at the end, you just prompt with a text or something, and it can generate the image for you. So now you can think of it as the new camera of the 20th century, or 21st century, where basically we no longer need a camera, physical camera, to create any scene. I can write down what I want, and the machine will give me an image or even a video. And this is getting better and better, and you don't need a camera anymore. And with that comes a big potentials, but big problems, because the fact that we believe in what's in an image coming from a camera is gone. So now I can really generate an image of anything. So yesterday there was a big debate on social media about Taylor Swift and photos of generated for Taylor Swift. Anyway, so we're no longer going to believe in what's in images anymore. But here's the question: is can the machine actually make art? The machine can make images. We know that the machine can make images, but making images is different from making art. All right, you can take a camera and make a photo, but doesn't make it art to take a photo. If you feed these generative systems images of art, what will happen? Suppose you give it lots and lots of images of art, and you feed it to whatever AI model you like. What it generates is basically a simulation of art, right? Because it learns from all these images of art and will generate more and more of that images. That's a simulation of art. And actually, in fact, what we did is that we give it this kind of art, and it generated this kind of deformed art. I need to wrap up because it's 10:30 now, so I'll try to be fast here. So when GANs came around, there was a lot of generation like that, where people try to generate these images of art. But again, the simulation of art. How can we move from being just emulating art to actually making something novel? So what we did is something called CAN, Creative Adversarial Network. We did this in 2017, and the idea here in a nutshell, I'm not going to go over the details here. So the theory is coming from psychology, and the main idea is that in art, artists push against habituation. If you keep doing the same kind of art again and again, become boring. So artists has to push against habituation to create something novel. However, that novelty push usually come with what's called least effort principle. Because if you push so much against habituation, you end up with generating something that's totally shocking, and people will reject it. This is what happened exactly to Picasso when he painted the latest Avenue. And nobody liked it, even his smaller circuit. So these two powers, habituation and innovation, push against each other to generate art and evolve art. And that's how basically art is created every day. And that's how great art is created. Great art is created by pushing more in that direction. Anyway, so what we did is basically we look at that theory and try to implement it. I'm skipping here that part here. And in a sense, in a nutshell, we developed the machine such that it follows the aesthetics from what happened in the art history. But if it tries to generate anything that exists in terms of styles, it gets banalized. So if the machine give me another impressionist art or another cubism art, I banalize it. Now the machine have to think hardly and generate something that follows general aesthetic art history, but give me something novel. And by just adding this constraint, everything changed. So instead of generating this, just by a small change in the motivation behind the creation, it started generating this kind of things. That was back in 2017 when Gans was just creating these uncanny looking images. And that really was very surprising to the art critic and art media, and because really that's considered to be very different. The machine can really create something totally novel, although I might argue that's not novel, but I mean, not really repeating a specific style, trying to innovate. Here's some of the example of the generation, variety of different styles, not only one style, try to explore new styles. And we did what's called Turing test, where we showed this artwork to subjects mixed up with artwork from actual contemporary art fair by actual artists. From Art Basel 2016 at the time, because that was the latest art history exhibits. Human subject thought that the image generated by AI is done by a human artist 75% of the time, compared to 85% of the time if you show them a typical abstract expressionist art from mid-20th century, compared to only 48% when actually show human subject art by actual artists from the Art Basel collection. So that tells us basically that human cannot tell whether an art is done by a machine or an artist. That doesn't make it art at all. It's still a machine just generating an image with no intention to make art. But the human subject cannot tell different. That's what they call a Turing test, which is a very, very primitive test to tell whether a machine can be intelligent. Anyway, here's some example of some of our exhibitions we have done in the past of this art in several places, and it will also have been shown in HBU Silicon Valley show. And in terms of reception in social circle in general, image generated by artists using AI have been very welcomed in many art venues, in art galleries, and Christie have an auction on AI made by art in art fairs, in museums as well. However, also there's a big debate now about AI, especially in the last 2 years when these trillion of images have been used in making images with all the problems. I need to stop here because of time, and I leave it open for questions. Thank you very much. Sorry for the long talk.
Harry, could you take down the screen sharing? And if anyone has questions, I have about 1,000, but I'll let other people go. Just wait for a microphone, and then we'll also check the Zoom as well. So there's one here, there's one there, there's some over there. So we'll move, there's some here. So we'll move the microphones all around, but go ahead.
Hello, excellent talk. Thank you for the talk. How much influence on the AI generated art do you think comes from the language neural networks and the art generators' understanding of the typed question?
In the last 2 years, with these large language models, when you train the AI with images and text, it's fundamentally based on the correlation between text and images that the machine learns. And that really help the quality of image generation. In terms of the creative process, if you're asking about how much of what I'm generating is really my art or my creativity versus the machine creativity, I would say a big part of it is a mining process. You are actually mining the system to push it to generate something from what it has learned. So your creativity is only limited to what prompts you're putting out to invoke the system to generate something. There is element of creativity, but big part of it is really mining what already exists in the network.
I think we'll go boom, 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 and then back and forth. So in the middle, there was a microphone right there.
These images are representations of art and pictures of works that artists have created. So can you talk a little bit about the application of the physical media? Because right now we're just talking about AI on a printer or pictures of Da Vinci or whatever this is, not the actual paint or tempera or that type of thing.
Yeah, obviously, that's correct. I mean, we are looking only at digitized images of the art, not the physical art itself. There are applications where you look at the physical art itself with other imaging techniques. In particular, things like authentication of art using AI can go to the level of brush strokes or even add depth information to that as well. A few years ago, there was a project called Making Rembrandt or something like that, where you generated new images of Rembrandt, taking into account brush strokes and little bit of information about depth of strokes as well into the generation. So yes, that can be added to the equation. However, in terms of making images, the composition is the most important thing, the composition and formal elements, not the physical medium. Unless you want to really render physical art, that becomes important.
Hello? Yeah, so my question is, can you simulate artistic dissatisfaction in a machine? So, because from my observation of the material as presented is, I don't think it's enough. I think it seems too artificial, it seems too fake. It's probably too harsh of a word, but it seems a little fake to have one algorithm that's creative and another algorithm that's in a different box for evaluation. I think the evaluation algorithm should emulate creativity and emulate the frustration that comes from creativity that's saturating it a little too much, or it's too much like the other. So I think there should be a lot more of a simulation for the competitive agents for the tail end of the whole computation or whatnot.
Yeah, that's an excellent question and topic. You are right, absolutely right. The current generative AI system that are used to make images that you see around DALL-E or Midjourney are not creative, are basically trained to learn a distribution of what you give it. And it's maximizing the similarity to that distribution. So a typical image out of this machine will become very typical that you have seen before. It's not really try to really push the boundary at all. So they are fundamentally anti-creative. Only creativity happens actually from the human using the machine by trying to invoke it to create something interesting. You are absolutely correct. However, the hard part about that aspect is that's where subjectivity comes into place. Your taste is different from the person next to you, right? And that subjectivity is really characterized by a curve that I showed in the background in the very end, the Bond curve from psychology, that really capture how much excitement you get from art and how that is something that you preferred or not. Some people prefer less excitement in what they see, and some people prefer very high excitement. For example, that's why, for example, Van Gogh is very popular now after more than 120 or 150 years, while some work of Picasso might not still be interesting to most people, or some work done by contemporary artists might be interested. Like I've seen 48% only of the people think human art, contemporary art is done by humans. That's because their taste is not really up to what's happening in today's world. These tastes maybe still stuck in impressionist art and Van Gogh. So that's really the matter of subjective element that's very fundamental to the question.
I think we have to create a neural network that knows, that has a feedback loop that bores it.
Totally. We are doing something like that now, actually.
So I have a question about some of your research and one of your early slides, you were showing the feature extraction. So like there were some aspects where I was extracting black versus white and some edges, but it was also doing color, and the color of paintings ages. So like our impression of some of these older artworks is affected by the fact that they've aged quite a bit, that the colors have faded. Also, you've got things like the availability of different paints over time that's going to impact, like, for example, titanium white or the availabilities of certain blues that you just couldn't have those colors in your early paintings. So it kind of leads me down the road of, like, is this actually extracting, like, to give you one of the classic examples, there's a research into pictures training a network versus identifying wolves versus dogs. And all of the pictures in the data sets were of wolves outside and dogs inside. And so instead of training on wolves versus dogs, they trained it on inside pictures versus outside pictures. Like, are we like, how sure you're actually getting the features that you're interested in and not just an artifact of your data set?
Totally. Yeah, this is a very fundamental question. You are talking about the bias in the data and the bias built in the algorithm as well. You're absolutely right. I mean, I cannot argue with that. And this is way deeper than we just scratch the surface. I have to, I mean, I didn't say that within the observation, just scratch the surface. When you look at, for example, at the example of quantifying creativity, the example I showed, we really focused on quantifying subject matter, which try to to avoid this problem of color variations over history. But the same algorithm can work if you really extract feature related to colors that are calibrated or compensating for that changes in color. And that will, if you do that, the algorithm will highlight the important changes in color usage, for example, over history. So you can really change the underlying kind of feature you're extracting, and you're giving totally different interpretation and give you different understanding of what's happening in art history. But you are absolutely right. That's really fundamental questions.
I think we're going to try to get a question from Zoom. Tony, I don't know if you can hear, because I don't have a mic right now. Harry, can you say Tony?
Tony, online from Zoom.
Tony, you there?
Tony, please have a question online from Zoom.
All right, so we will go. I know there's a question in the middle and the back. Tony Singleton, I don't know if you could hear us or not, but you had your hand up before. Anyway, in the back, I know there was a question.
My question is, apart from art, are you also analyzing music? Is there any study being done on classical music and music?
Yeah, actually, there was a part of the talk I was talking about that, but I didn't have time. One of the projects we have done is last couple of years is completing Beethoven 10th Symphony. So that was in Europe. So basically, Beethoven left 9 symphonies, but he also left us sketches for 10th Symphony. So one of the projects that we have done was in celebration of Beethoven 200th anniversary. How can we revive or build the 10th Symphony of Beethoven from his sketches? So what we did is that we trained AI models on classical music prior to Beethoven, and then trained these models on Beethoven artworks. And now these models can really get the essence of Beethoven's style of music. And then we fitted these sketches, and it started completing it and building up on it. And it even learned the orchestration of Beethoven. So if you search online Beethoven 10th Symphony, you're going to find the work that we have done.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions. So we'll do one right here, and then the last one will be
There's
there.
some questions here also, but need to be somebody to read them.
Okay.
Professor Elgammal, thank you very much for this lecture. And the original slides showing us the analysis that AI can do is really quite brilliant and fascinating. However, that then leads to the question of questions. Is AI racist and is it gendered? Because you're looking at the data that is, AI can only come up with conclusions based on data. And you were looking at paintings of the last 500 years, but they were Western, it was Western art by white and men. And so then what happens if you end up, and I was fascinated with the prime images in correlation to the prime numbers. So if you look at prime images, some of the iconography goes back 10,000 years, and that doesn't get factored in. That would certainly change the analysis. But the question is, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa or Asia or the Americas or Australia imagery, then or imagery from women, then everything would be changed. So if you're looking at AI in general, whether it is making or critiquing art or any of the other uses, the writing, you can see how dangerous being racist or gendered would change the conclusions and everything going forward. Can you comment?
Yes, totally. I totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. Thank you. We all know AI is based on the data that you feed it. You have to make a distinction between the algorithm itself and its capability and what data you fed, which affect what conclusion you're going to make. Everything that you see here is basically based on Western art history, and these are the data that have been already pre-curated in museum, the canon of art history as we know it. It didn't take into account what happened in art history, even Western art history that was not accepted or was rejected or not in the museum. Didn't take into account other part of the world, like nothing about not much or not at all from China or Japanese art or African art. Totally. That doesn't affect the conclusion, obviously. But if you look at the conclusions with the scope that this is only Western art history in the last 500 years, are these conclusions valid or not? That's how we should ask the question. Is the algorithm itself, is the limitation of the algorithm itself? No. If you feed the algorithm the right data, that's more from all over the world, from over the history, definitely the conclusion will change and will become much useful. So we have to make always a distinction between the AI ability to do things and the data that you feed it. The data you feed it is really a limitation of what's existing today. Like I can find easily millions of images from Western art history. I can hardly find any images from African art. I can find maybe 1,000 images. So images are digitized and available to feed the data, the algorithm. So these are mainly limitation of what we can feed the algorithm. And obviously limitation also bias of the people who are making the algorithm if they are not aware of these questions. But in our papers, we always highlight this, that these data are used. And another aspect is that when you talk about creativity and evolution of art history, we intentionally wanted to focus on a specific region like Western arts, because how art evolved can be very different in different cultures. For example, in Chinese culture, the issue of innovation is very different from Western art, especially in the last few hundred years. In Chinese art, it's following the master or the mastery is really fundamental in Chinese art. So there might be cultural aspect that's very different that we are not addressing here. So that's why we focus on a particular canon of art from Western art to really understand the limitation and the possibilities of the algorithm. And then you can always feed other data to have better conclusion and make and answer more important questions. Thank you very much.
And one last question.
And in Oh, there we go. In your opinion, do you think that AI will eventually take the jobs of future artists or even other jobs like architecture, building, or anything in the medical field?
That's a very fundamental question. I can talk about that for an hour. Um, um, I believe art is fundamentally made by human. Human are the one who making the art. Human can use any tools and any technology, and they have been doing that for the last 5,000 years and more. And whatever technology come around, they use it in a way to make art. And AI is no different. Will AI will take jobs of some creative artist? Yes, unfortunately. For example, if you are a photographer, probably it will take some of the jobs of photography. It will take some of the jobs of illustrators. You can easily make computer graphics now with a text on DALL-E or things like that. So there's going to be less need for many creatives. Will it take the job of fine art artists who really make art to be shown in galleries? No, because basically fine art in particular is an art that's a connection between the artist and the observer who see the art. And these artists will use AI art as a tool in their canon if they want to. So it is definitely a very deep question that we can talk about for a long time.
And with that, if we could thank you one more time for such a thought-provoking talk.
Thank you. I apologize for the Zoom audience that we didn't take any of the questions. I can always contact me for
Yeah.
questions.
And next week, Professor Sandra Adams from Montclair State University talking about viruses and natural ways that we can attack them.